How could a 5-year-old boy, full of hope and promise, end up dead in his own home? This isn't just another case of child abuse. It's a failure on every level, a tragic death that could have been prevented. But what went wrong? How did a child, entrusted to those who should have loved and cared for him, end up in a situation where no one heard his cries? Imagine being a child who was never heard, never seen, and never protected. This is the story of Ethan Belcher, his dreams, his family, and the catastrophic failures that led to his death. But before we dive into the heartbreaking details, we must ask the question, how many other children are out there, living in silence, just waiting for someone to step in? Ethan Belcher was a 5-year-old boy with so much potential. His future should have been filled with laughter, the kind of joy every child deserves. Playing with his younger brother, learning to ride his bike, dreaming of his future, these should have been his memories. But instead, Ethan's short life was marked by a horrifying reality, a life of neglect, isolation, and unimaginable suffering. Born into a broken family, his life was anything but ordinary. Their home should have been a safe place, a haven where Ethan could find comfort, but instead, it became a prison. From the moment Ethan was born, his life seemed to be defined by chaos and instability. But like so many children who grow up in environments where love is scarce, his story would be marred by more than just neglect. It would be a story of missed opportunities, a system that failed him, and a tragedy that could have been prevented. Detroit, Michigan, a city struggling with its own set of issues, was the backdrop of Ethan's life. In the heart of this city, in a small house hidden behind closed doors, Ethan's story unfolded. His biological mother, Valeria, had been battling addiction for years, unable to provide the stability her children desperately needed. But what's worse? Ethan's story wasn't isolated. He wasn't the only child suffering in silence. Despite multiple reports to Child Protective Services, CPS, and the clear signs of neglect and abuse, nothing was done to intervene in time. Ethan's family reported the abuse. Neighbors saw the signs. Teachers noticed the distress. Yet, somehow, this child and his brother remained in the same home, suffering day after day. How did this happen? How many signs need to be ignored before someone finally steps in? How many missed opportunities does it take before a child is protected? Was it apathy? Was it bureaucracy? Or was it a broken system that didn't know how to act when it was needed the most? The answers are not easy, and they're not clear. What is certain is that Ethan's death was not a simple tragedy. It was the result of multiple failures, a chain of events that was set into motion long before his life was taken. Why wasn't something done sooner? What more could have been done to save Ethan's life? And how many more children, like him, are out there, living in danger, ignored by the very system that's supposed to protect them? Ethan's story doesn't end here. We'll be diving deeper into the events that led to his tragic fate. We'll uncover the shocking truths, the failures of the system, and how his story sparked outrage and calls for reform. But before we continue, we must ask ourselves, what happens when a system meant to protect fails so dramatically? Ethan Belcher was just 5 years old. At this tender age, he was meant to be filled with wonder, laughter, and the innocence of childhood. His days should have been filled with the carefree joy that comes from playing with toys, exploring the world, and dreaming about the future. But for Ethan, his reality was different. He was a boy stuck in a cycle of neglect, enduring pain and suffering far beyond what anyone his age should ever experience. His once bright eyes were clouded with the weight of neglect and abuse that no child should ever bear. Ethan, with his untapped potential, was a symbol of lost innocence. Like so many children in abusive households, he longed for something more: safety, love, and the warmth of a family that truly cared for him. But instead, Ethan was trapped in a world far from that. He had a younger brother, just 3 years old, and while they shared a bond that should have been built on play and comfort, both were subjected to the same horrifying neglect. They clung to each other in the harsh, cold reality they were forced to live. Their bond should have been a source of joy, but instead, it became a source of shared pain and suffering. The brothers were left to fend for themselves in an environment that no child should ever endure. Ethan's life, from the very beginning, was defined by instability. Born into a fractured family, his future was already marred by the toxic forces surrounding him. His biological mother, Valeria Hamilton, and her partner, Shane Shelton, created a dangerous and neglectful environment that would shape Ethan's young life in unimaginable ways. Valeria Hamilton, a 29-year-old woman, had lived a life that lacked stability. She was a mother trapped by the shackles of addiction, struggling with substance abuse that would ultimately define much of her relationship with her children. Valeria was not the mother Ethan and his younger brother needed. She couldn't provide the care and safety that every child deserves. The constant turmoil in her life, marked by poor choices and her inability to care for her children, left Ethan vulnerable in ways he couldn't escape. Shane Shelton, Valeria's partner, played a pivotal role in the abuse and neglect that both Ethan and his brother suffered. At 29 years old, Shelton, who had a history of criminal activity, was a figure in Ethan's life that should have never been. His behavior, combined with Valeria's instability, created a deadly combination that would result in the tragic loss of a young child's life. Together, they created an environment of fear, pain, and abuse. They had no business taking care of children, yet Ethan and his brother were placed in their care. The neglect was far from subtle. Ethan and his brother lived in a home filled with unimaginable neglect, where they were treated as expendable, their suffering ignored by those who were supposed to protect them. Their abuse wasn't just physical. It was systemic, a failure of a family that should have been held accountable. But it wasn't just Valeria and Shane who failed Ethan. It was a society that allowed this to happen. Reports of neglect and signs of abuse were overlooked by those in a position to intervene, and nothing was done to stop the cycle of violence that Ethan was living through. Despite repeated reports to Child Protective Services, CPS, the children were allowed to stay in their mother's custody. How many warning signs were missed? How many times did the system fail Ethan, his brother, and their family? The cries for help were heard but not acted upon, leaving the children to suffer in silence. CPS had been alerted to the Belcher family's situation on multiple occasions. Neighbors, family members, and even teachers noticed the signs. They saw the bruises on Ethan's small body and the emotional distress in his eyes. Yet, despite these signs, no significant intervention took place. The system, designed to protect children, turned a blind eye, allowing this suffering to continue. It's easy to point fingers at Valeria and Shane for their actions, but the real question is, how did the system, the very institutions meant to protect children, fail so miserably? How was a child like Ethan allowed to live in a house full of neglect and pain? Was it a matter of ignorance, neglect, or something deeper, an institutional failure too pervasive to ignore? As we unravel the tragedy that befell Ethan Belcher, the true extent of the failures becomes clearer. Ethan's story was not an isolated incident, and his life was not the only one that was destroyed by this system. The questions linger: why didn't someone intervene sooner? How many reports need to be made before something is done? And most hauntingly, could Ethan's life have been saved if someone had acted when they had the chance? These questions will echo throughout this case, and as we move forward, we will uncover the truth of how Ethan's life was stolen and the deep flaws that allowed his suffering to continue. But for now, we must ask ourselves, what does this case say about the system that was supposed to protect him? And how many more children are still at risk today because of these same failures? What happens when a child is trapped in a cage of pain, with no way to escape? Ethan Belcher and his younger brother were born into a world where safety was a distant dream. They should have been surrounded by the warmth of love, but instead, their lives were steeped in cold neglect, brutal punishments, and isolation. No child, especially one so young, should have to live like this. Yet for months, this was their reality. The basement, meant to house their belongings, became their prison. The pain of Ethan's life wasn't just one terrible event, it was a slow, suffocating build-up of suffering that stretched over months. What was supposed to be a child's world of safety and joy turned into an endless cycle of abuse and neglect, hidden behind the closed doors of a home that should have been a sanctuary. Ethan Belcher, a 5-year-old boy with a future full of possibilities, was caught in the invisible grasp of neglect. Alongside him, his 3-year-old brother endured the same unimaginable cruelty. The house, a place where they should have felt safe, was anything but. The environment inside their home became a prison of fear, where punishment for the slightest disobedience was cruel and unrelenting. The daily routine for Ethan and his brother was marked by hunger, exhaustion, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Valeria Hamilton, their biological mother, and Shane Shelton, her partner, created an atmosphere where love was a foreign concept. What could have been a home full of warmth and protection quickly devolved into a space where terror thrived. The beatings began with everyday objects, a broken fly swatter, a metal pipe, wires, tools that would scar both their bodies and their souls. When Ethan misbehaved or when his mother was frustrated with something as small as a minor mistake, the punishment was swift and severe. One of the most brutal methods of punishment was when Valeria and Shane would drag the boys into a small, makeshift area in the home. This was not a basement, as some might assume, but a small, isolated corner of the house, where they would be locked away. This confined space, often filled with the stench of unclean surroundings, became their time out, except it was nothing like a typical punishment. Instead, it was where they would be left in a cold, isolated space, sometimes for hours at a time. The boys' bodies bore the marks of their suffering. Ethan, the older of the two, had bruises on his tiny arms and legs, signs of the beatings he had endured for no reason other than the frustrations of a mother overwhelmed by addiction and a stepfather who saw cruelty as a form of control. The wounds weren't just physical. Their spirits were broken too. The situation grew worse as Ethan's condition worsened. He wasn't just neglected, he was harmed in ways no child should ever endure. At one point, the frostbite on Ethan's toes was so severe that gangrene set in. His little body, already weakened from hunger and constant punishment, struggled against the infection. Yet, there was no help. No one stepped in. No one came to rescue him. Ethan's aunties, Ashley Belcher and Candace Rush, had seen the signs. They had seen how the children appeared at school, how they often came in looking exhausted, their clothes dirty and torn, their bodies gaunt from hunger. Michaela, especially, noticed how Ethan's once vibrant personality had begun to wither. He was no longer the boy who laughed and played. Instead, he had become a shadow of the child he once was, quiet, withdrawn, and distant. It was as if all the light inside him had been extinguished. Ashley Belcher and Candace Rush tried, again and again, to step in. They knew that the children's lives were at risk. They called authorities, reported the abuse, and pleaded with anyone who would listen. Yet, each time, they were dismissed. CPS had been contacted multiple times, but still, nothing changed. They were told the same thing: the children are fine. There's nothing to worry about. Candace Rush could hardly breathe with the weight of knowing what was happening in that home. How could Ethan and his brother be left to suffer? The children were crying out for help in every way they could, but no one was listening. On the rare occasions that Ethan's aunties would visit, they could see the changes in him. He would cling to them, the brief moments of affection offering a brief respite from the horrors of his reality. But the system failed to act. Despite the clear signs, the continued reports, and the swelling concerns of the family, the boys remained trapped. And still the beatings didn't stop. Throughout their stay at home, the abuse didn't stop. The emotional toll was immeasurable for both Ethan and his brother. Each day felt like the last, each minute slipping further and further into a nightmare that they couldn't escape. Could this have been stopped? Could the system have intervened before it was too late? Could someone have stepped in, someone who cared enough to take action? As the days turned into weeks, the pressure of unanswered questions grew heavier. Ethan's condition had been deteriorating for days, but no one intervened. What had been escalating signs of neglect and abuse quickly reached a tragic, inevitable conclusion the day Ethan's fragile body could take no more. It was January 27, 2023, when Ethan's life came to a heartbreaking end. His mother, Valeria Hamilton, had been oblivious to the critical state he was in. Her failure to seek medical attention and the apparent disregard for his suffering marked the culmination of months of abuse. That fateful day, Ethan was found unresponsive, lifeless in the home where he had been tortured and neglected for so long. It wasn't a sudden illness that claimed his life, it was the culmination of repeated physical abuse, neglect, and an utter lack of care. Ethan's body, already worn down by the ongoing suffering, succumbed to the severe trauma. His mother, Valeria, having seen the signs, now realized the gravity of what had happened, but it was too late. She reportedly panicked and called for help. But there was no immediate response from the authorities. Ethan's death had already been sealed by the abuse that had marked his life, and his death would soon become a catalyst for something far greater than just a tragic loss. It would bring to light the systemic failures that allowed his life to slip through the cracks. The final call to authorities was made by Ethan's aunt, who had been fighting for months to get Ethan and his brother out of the abusive environment. After several previous failed attempts to have CPS intervene, it was the aunt who made the call on January 22, 2023, pleading with CPS about the children's deteriorating condition. She had grown desperate, repeatedly trying to draw attention to the alarming abuse the boys were enduring. Her call highlighted the worsening conditions in the home, detailing Ethan's physical and emotional suffering. This final, urgent call from the aunt would mark a critical moment in the investigation. Unfortunately, despite her repeated attempts to warn CPS, it was too late to save Ethan. Just 5 days later, on January 27, the authorities arrived to find Ethan's lifeless body, and the tragedy that had been festering for months came to a crushing conclusion. The immediate aftermath of his death would unravel in a way no one could have imagined. Authorities, now fully aware of the abuse, began to piece together the puzzle. They would soon discover evidence of the horrific conditions the children had been forced to live in, the numerous missed opportunities by child welfare services to intervene, and the systemic failures that had ultimately led to this point. The public, outraged by the negligence, rallied in support of Ethan's family, demanding justice for the young boy whose life had been taken far too soon. Investigators scrambled to make sense of the tragedy that had occurred. Ethan's lifeless body, discovered on January 27, 2023, marked the heartbreaking end to a life cut far too short. But what followed was a search for answers, a search for justice, and an examination of how this was allowed to happen. The investigation into Ethan's death unfolded in a way no one could have anticipated. The investigators began piecing together the disturbing facts, starting with the autopsy report that would reveal the extent of the abuse Ethan had suffered. The young boy had been subjected to repeated physical violence, his body bruised and battered from head to toe. The medical examiner's findings showed that Ethan had suffered from internal injuries, possibly caused by the extreme physical punishment. Gangrene had set in on his toes as a result of frostbite, something that no child should ever experience. But the medical reports were just the beginning. As authorities delved deeper into the case, they discovered that the situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. The children had been living in an environment of neglect and violence, locked away from the world. The basement, where the children were sometimes confined, had been found to be unsanitary, filled with sewage and filth, conditions that were appalling for anyone, let alone vulnerable children. The physical evidence, the autopsy findings, and the harrowing accounts from witnesses slowly painted a picture of what life had been like for Ethan and his younger brother. It was a life defined by fear, neglect, and a complete absence of safety. One of the most crucial elements that came to light during the investigation was the critical role of Ethan's aunt, who had tried repeatedly to warn authorities about the abuse. She had contacted Child Protective Services, CPS, several times in the months leading up to Ethan's death, describing the alarming conditions and her concerns about the children's welfare. Her calls for help went unanswered, and even when she escalated the situation, there was still no intervention. Her final plea for help, the call she made just days before Ethan's death, would serve as a turning point in the investigation. She was adamant that something needed to be done immediately. She knew that the children were at risk, and sadly, her fears were proven right. The tragedy that followed would uncover the depth of CPS's failure, as reports of neglect, abuse, and threats had been ignored multiple times. The public's response to Ethan's death was swift and furious. Social media erupted in outrage, with many people demanding answers and justice for the young boy who had been failed by the very system meant to protect him. The community rallied around Ethan's family, particularly his aunt, who had tirelessly tried to protect him. There was a growing call for reforms in the child welfare system, and a clear message was sent that no child should have to suffer like this again. People from all walks of life expressed their disgust at how the case had been mishandled and how the signs of abuse had been ignored. The media began to focus more on the failings of CPS, highlighting the agency's inability to prevent Ethan's tragic fate despite numerous warnings. As the investigation gained momentum, authorities turned their focus to the two individuals responsible for Ethan's suffering: his biological mother, Valeria Hamilton, and her partner, Shane Shelton. Both were arrested and charged with felony murder, torture, and first-degree child abuse. The charges brought a sense of justice, but it was clear that no legal consequence could ever truly bring back Ethan or undo the damage caused. During their initial court appearances, Hamilton and Shelton appeared to show little remorse for their actions. Their demeanor in court left the community feeling even more enraged. Ethan's family sat through the hearings, hoping for justice but knowing that no punishment could truly make up for the life of a young child lost. As the case progressed, more details came to light. Investigators began to piece together a timeline of Ethan's life leading up to his death. The timeline revealed that, despite multiple reports of abuse and numerous visits from social workers, no meaningful intervention had taken place. CPS had failed to protect Ethan and his brother. Even after warnings from the aunt, there had been no action taken. This failure was devastating, and it prompted a wider conversation about the limitations and flaws in the child welfare system. How many more children were slipping through the cracks? How many more families were suffering in silence, with no one willing to intervene in time? The road to justice for Ethan's family was long and painful. It wasn't just about the arrest of his mother and her partner, it was about holding the system accountable for its negligence. The charges brought against Hamilton and Shelton would eventually lead to a trial, and the eyes of the nation would be on the case. But even as the trial unfolded, they couldn't help but wonder, how many children were still out there, suffering in silence, with no one to hear their cries? How could they change the system so this tragedy never happened again? Ethan's story didn't end in the courtroom. It continued to resonate with the public, with many still fighting for reforms in child welfare systems across the country. His death was a heartbreaking reminder that the system designed to protect children had failed him at every turn. And now, it was time for the public and the government to take action. Ethan's death became a symbol of the failure to protect vulnerable children, a symbol of the flaws within the system. The questions remain: how many more children are out there, living in fear? And how many will it take before the system is truly held accountable? Ethan's legacy must live on in the fight for justice, for change, and for a world where no child suffers like he did. But what drove Valeria Hamilton and Shane Shelton to commit such horrific acts? What led them to strip Ethan and his brother of their childhood and humanity? It's a question that lingers, though no answer can ever justify the torment they inflicted upon their own flesh and blood. Valeria, caught in a cycle of addiction and neglect, found herself incapable of providing the care her children needed. Shane, an unreliable partner, compounded the dysfunction. Together, they created an environment where love, care, and protection were nowhere to be found. Ethan and his younger brother became the casualties of a broken family dynamic and a lack of intervention from the very system meant to protect them. The courtroom was heavy with tension as Ethan's family, finally, had their moment to speak. The day of justice had arrived, but it came at a price too steep for anyone to bear. The pain of losing Ethan was still fresh, yet his family stood strong, demanding accountability for the horrors they had witnessed and endured. Their cries for justice echoed, not only for Ethan but for the countless children like him whose voices were silenced by a broken system. Valeria Hamilton, Ethan's biological mother, and Shane Shelton, her partner, had caused more than just physical harm to Ethan. Their cruelty was systematic, a slow but steady erosion of the love and care every child deserves. The abuse wasn't just about the bruises and the burns, it was about the indifference, the coldness, the utter neglect that led to Ethan's slow demise. As the trial began, it became clear that the horrors inflicted upon Ethan were far worse than anyone could have imagined. The details, chilling in their brutality, painted a picture of two individuals who should never have been trusted with the responsibility of caring for any child. But the most heartbreaking part of all was that Ethan was failed not just by them, but by the very system that was supposed to protect him. The emotional testimony from Ethan's family weighed heavily in the courtroom. His aunts, who had fought tirelessly to gain custody, spoke with heart-wrenching sorrow, recalling the countless attempts to intervene, only to be ignored by Child Protective Services. Their words were filled with raw emotion, rage, regret, and sorrow. They spoke about how Ethan and his younger brother, in their most vulnerable moments, had been left at the mercy of those who only hurt them. But the real shock came when the verdict was read. Was it enough? Was the punishment truly fitting for what had been done to Ethan? And what would happen to those responsible for failing him? Was justice truly served, or was this just another step in a long, painful road for those left behind? The trial finally came to a close, and the fate of Valeria Hamilton and Shane Shelton was sealed. The severity of their actions could not be ignored, and both were convicted of first-degree felony murder, torture, and child endangerment. But the question lingered, would the sentencing bring any comfort to Ethan's family, or was it too little, too late? Valeria Hamilton, Ethan's mother, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court ruled that she had, with deliberate cruelty, betrayed the trust of her own child, leading to his death in the most horrific way possible. Shane Shelton, her partner, faced the same fate, life in prison without the possibility of parole. His role in Ethan's abuse was undeniable, and the court could not, and would not, forgive the violence he had inflicted on an innocent child. For Ethan's family, the sentencing was bittersweet. They had fought for justice, for recognition of the pain they had suffered. But could anything truly ease the ache of losing a child in such a brutal, preventable way? While the courtroom was filled with a sense of closure, the public outcry that followed Ethan's death did not fade away. The community rallied around Ethan's family, demanding answers, justice, and reforms. It became clear that this tragedy was part of a much larger issue, a broken child welfare system that had failed not just Ethan, but countless other children. Michigan State Senator Jim Runestad was one of the most vocal figures in the push for reform. He proposed changes to the state's child welfare laws, arguing that the system's failure to act in Ethan's case was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of deeper, systemic issues. The push for increased CPS accountability grew louder, with more and more voices calling for real change to prevent another child from suffering in silence. But the question remains, what more can be done? Can we really fix the flaws in the system, or are these stories of failure just inevitable tragedies waiting to happen again? As the legal battles concluded, Ethan's family faced the hard truth that no amount of prison time would ever bring back their beloved boy. But what about the future? What about the children still trapped in unsafe environments, still waiting for someone to listen? Ethan's story is one of many, but will it be the last? Can we ensure that his death wasn't in vain? The journey toward meaningful reform has just begun, but will it be enough to prevent future tragedies? In the wake of Ethan Belcher's heartbreaking death, a profound sense of loss weighed heavily on his family, the community, and all who heard his story. But amidst their grief, something powerful began to emerge from the depths of grief, a collective call to action. Ethan's story became more than just a tragedy. It became a catalyst for change, a beacon for reform, and a plea for the system to finally do what it was supposed to do: protect children. Ethan's family, devastated by the loss of their young loved one, could have fallen into despair. Instead, they chose a path that would honor his memory, giving it meaning in a way that no amount of grief could ever replace. Their sorrow was palpable, but so was their resolve. They turned their grief into a force for good. Alongside local organizations and concerned citizens, they raised funds, not for their own healing, but for something much greater: reform within the child welfare system. These funds were used to support critical initiatives, from educational workshops for parents and caregivers to providing counseling services for families in need. It was their way of making sure that no other child would suffer as Ethan did, that no child would slip through the cracks. But it wasn't just Ethan's family who took action. Local social workers, child advocacy groups, and other concerned citizens rallied together. They recognized the failure of the system, but they knew that awareness alone wasn't enough. Change wouldn't come by simply pointing fingers at a broken system. They needed solutions. They needed resources. One of the most important outcomes of this collective effort was the establishment of support networks for at-risk families. These networks provided much-needed services: parenting classes, mental health support, financial assistance, and the crucial resources that could help prevent abuse before it began. But the question remained, would these efforts be enough? Could they truly fix the system that had failed Ethan so horribly? The battle didn't stop with local initiatives. As Ethan's story gained national attention, lawmakers across Michigan took notice. The fight for reform didn't stop at local meetings or individual efforts. It escalated into a full-fledged call for change. Advocates for children, lawmakers, and citizens came together, all united under one banner: reform. The goal was clear: a system where children could thrive, not just survive, and where no more children like Ethan would be left vulnerable in homes that couldn't protect them. But will the reforms be enough? Will the voices of Ethan's family and the millions who demand change be heard? Ethan's legacy, though tragically brief, lives on in the fight for change. His story continues to inspire those who demand a system that protects children from harm. His name will forever be tied to the movement for reform, for accountability, and for the safety of every child in the system. Painful chapter in a much larger narrative, a story that continues every day in homes, schools, and communities across the country. Children continue to suffer, often unnoticed, and far too many fall through the cracks of a system that was designed to protect them. The time for change is now. We must demand better from our child welfare system. We must insist that agencies do more than just check boxes and file reports. We need to ensure that social workers, foster parents, and every person involved in a child's life are held accountable. And we must make sure that children like Ethan are no longer ignored or left to suffer in silence. This story is a painful reminder of what happens when we fail to act. But it also holds the power to change the future. By sharing Ethan's story, by raising awareness, and by continuing to advocate for the children who cannot advocate for themselves, we can ensure that his legacy is not one of loss, but of hope and action. We owe it to Ethan. We owe it to every child who has been failed by the system. Let's make sure that no child is ever left to suffer the way Ethan did. Ethan's story doesn't end with his death. It continues with us. What do you think needs to change in our child welfare system? How can we, as a society, make sure that no child like Ethan is ever left behind again? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video to raise awareness and advocate for the change our children deserve. Thank you for watching, and for standing with Ethan's legacy. Together, we can make a difference. Love you all and stay safe.